for this American, this member, this representative of the people of the District of Columbia to come forward on occasion with information and material that I hope members will take under advisement. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady yields back under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a privilege to be recognized by you to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives. And as I listened to the dialogue take place here over the last 30 minutes, and the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, I'm glad she has a voice here in this Congress, and I do take an oath to uphold the Constitution, as does everyone who serves in this body, as does the President of the United States and many of our executive officers and every military personnel. And I believe every state legislator takes an oath, as I did when I was in the State Senate in Iowa, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state of Iowa. But as that oath takes place, I would just I would remind this, Mr. Speaker, that we have to have an understanding of the Constitution in order to take an oath to the Constitution. And when we place our hand on the Bible and raise our right hand and take the oath to the Constitution of the United States, it's not an oath to a Constitution as it might be reinterpreted by activist judges at a later date. It's not even an oath to a Constitution that has been interpreted by the activist judges that came after the Constitution was ratified. The oath that I take to uphold this Constitution is the oath to uphold the Constitution as it was written, as the clear text of the Constitution defines, and as the amendments, the clear text of the amendments define, and as it was understood to mean at the time of the ratification, whether it would be the full body of the Constitution, or later on the Bill of Rights, or whether it would be the subsequent amendments to the Constitution. And no public official, no person who takes an oath to a Constitution can be taken an oath to something that is amorphous, something that fluctuates, something that can change. The Constitution has to be fixed in place. Guarantees aren't amorphous, Mr. Speaker. It is no guarantee if it's amorphous. It has to be fixed in place, fixed in time. And I understand that our language changes over time. And I understand that we have people that have looked at this Constitution with disrespect, and they would like to disregard the American Constitution. And if we look back through history, we will see that there was an effort that began in the late 19th century, especially when some of the liberal thinking people emerged here in the intellectual world in the United States. Many of those people that came here from Germany and established themselves. In fact, they established themselves on the West Coast, and our friend whom we've expressed our deep regrets at the loss of, and our deep sympathy to the family of Andrew Breitbart, grew up around some of those people that were the foundation of the progressive movement in America. These are the people that grew from the socialism, the ideology of utopianism. Karl Marx put it down, and it grew from there, and Lenin advanced it, and Gramsci also advanced it, and it's gone on to today where liberalism got a bad reputation, so they decided to define themselves as progressives. It's all rooted in a Marxist, socialist, utopian ideology. And that Marxist, utopian, socialist ideology looks at the United States Constitution, the Constitution of the United States of America, with abhorrence. They reject our Constitution. They're just afraid to stand up and say so. And so the clear meaning of the Constitution is something that they concluded back in the late part of the 19th century and coming into the early part of the 20th century, that they would like to abolish our Constitution. They would like to have a new constitutional convention or no Constitution and change and shape America at their will, not an America with individual rights that come from God, that I would like to think the gentlelady from the District of Columbia and I would agree on, but an America that can always be in constant flux, in constant change, with no locked down guarantees or values. In other words, they looked at an effort to undo and repeal America's Constitution and concluded that they could not do so because the culture of America has so embraced the Constitution of the United States that just our defense of the Constitution would be enough for them to, if they assaulted the Constitution, Americans would rise up and reject anybody that would seek to do that. And so they said, well, there's an alternative of trying to repeal and undo the Constitution and amend it out of existence, or there's another alternative. And that alternative is the one that they chose more than 100 years ago. That was the effort to redefine the Constitution, to undermine the meaning of the Constitution and turn it into this, remember the language, Mr. Speaker, a living, breathing document? A living, breathing document is a language for an amorphous Constitution, a Constitution with no guarantees, a Constitution that only takes reaction to the majority at the time that can be found in the House of Representatives, in the United States Senate, or a majority in the United States Supreme Court, or the activist judges that by the hundreds have been appointed since that period of time over the last more than 100 years. And the law schools in America that have been populated by leftists who have been undermining the Constitution even while they teach the Constitution. That's what we've seen here in America, Mr. Speaker, and if the solid, conservative American people understood the flow of history and how the Constitution's been willfully undermined by active and by now self-labeled progressives, they would stand up against them everywhere where they appear. When you think of a contract, the Constitution is a contract. It is a guarantee. It is the supreme law of the land. It's defined as the supreme law of the land in the Constitution itself. When you have a supreme law, a law has to be black and white. It has to be clear, and it must be also enforced. And to take an oath to something that's amorphous, that's living and breathing, something that now is being taught under Constitution law in universities across the land, this Constitution doesn't mean what it says. That's what some of the judges say. That's what some of the law school professors say. In fact, that's what a majority of the law schools in America teach. Not the foundation of American liberty, the clear text of this Constitution, but they teach that it's something that's been redefined by the courts. And by the way, we have course after course across the country, and I could go back to my big ring notebook when we did the research on this, that teaches Constitution law in law school without using the basis of the Constitution. You can take the course on con law and never be required to read the Constitution, and the test questions aren't on the Constitution, they're on what they call case law. Well, and I'll sometimes refer to case law. It's usually a slip of the tongue when I do that. Case law being what they say now is the Constitution. And I think of a lawyer who said, you know, I don't have to amend the Constitution. You give me a favorable judge and a favorable jury, I'll amend the Constitution in the courtroom. Think of what that means, Mr. Speaker. The attack on the Constitution that's been taking place by activist lawyer after activist lawyer with favorable judge after favorable judge in front of a favorable jury that a lot of times just doesn't know the movement of the currents in this country and the competition that's going on between two philosophies and ideologies. One of them mirrors the words of our founding fathers, the beliefs and the foundation of our founding fathers. Our rights come from God. No place in history did we see that aside from the New Testament. No government was ever formed on the foundation of religious belief and believing that we have individual human rights, that these rights come from God. We're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. I don't say inalienable. That is a typo in the Jefferson Monument down here. It's unalienable rights. We're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We all know those words. They echoed us. They are writ on our heart as Americans. And we should remember that our founding fathers, inspired and I believe guided by God, articulated the vision of the unique liberty that's endowed within each of us who are created in His image. They articulated it, they understood it, they made the argument, they laid it out in the Declaration, they fought a war for it, and they enshrined it within the Constitution itself, this rule of law. Now, how hard was that compared to our charge today, Mr. Speaker? How hard was it in comparison? Founding Fathers identifying liberty, articulating liberty, using the language and the scholarship that they created to write on our hearts life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as an aside, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't an accident that they delivered to us 3 distinct rights, not exclusive to those 3. When they said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Thomas Jefferson didn't just pull those things out of a hat and say, well, let me see, life came out first, and then let me see, what's the next one? Well, it's like a Chinese fortune cookie, liberty, and the third one he pulled out was pursuit of happiness. They are carefully placed in the Declaration because they are prioritized rights. The most important right is life. The next most important right is liberty, and the last of the 3 is pursuit of happiness. So let me start with pursuit of happiness, Mr. Speaker. And our Founding Fathers, and especially Thomas Jefferson, studied and understood Greek. And they looked back in the history of Greece and they understood what this term that I will pronounce eudaimonia. It's a Greek term that really is pursuit of happiness. And it's spelled E-U-D-A-M-O-N-I-A. Eudaimonia, by my pronunciation. And what it means is to be intellectually and spiritually whole, to pursue knowledge, to pursue an understanding of this unique being that we are, with a soul, with a spirit, with an intellect, and to expand that to the maximum limit that God has given us. That was eudaimonia. Pursuit of happiness wasn't a tailgate party at the ball game. Pursuit of happiness was the Greek understanding of happiness, which was developing your whole being to the maximum amount. So Thomas Jefferson placed that pursuit of happiness language in there, understanding what it meant in the Greek understanding. He understood what it meant to the Americans at the time. That's been redefined since that time to now people think somehow pursuit of happiness is the tailgate party or go to the ball game or go out on the deck and light the grill or go down to the corner pub and have a drink with the guys. Whatever it is that people do, go fishing, go skiing in the mountains, that's pursuit of happiness? None of that was in the minds of the Founding Fathers. What was in their minds was the ability to have the freedom that God gave us to develop ourselves as human beings spiritually and intellectually. That was eudaimonia, that was the pursuit of happiness, and it was the third right, Mr. Speaker. The second one was liberty. And liberty, we understand, I think, liberty better here in America than in the rest of the world. Liberty is a component of our history. It often gets conflated with the term freedom. Freedom and liberty are 2 different terms, though, Mr. Speaker. And they have 2 different meanings, even though they're associated with each other. Now, you might think of freedom, you know, as I look across outside the snowy landscape where I live, and sometimes I'll see a coyote run across the field, and I'll think, well, he has freedom. He's out there in the wild. He can run wherever he wants to run. No fence keeps him in. He's free to chase down rabbits and anything else that he wants to go after, and my pheasants, I might say. He has freedom, but there's a difference between freedom and liberty. Freedom is, the distinction is this: liberty is freedom bridled by morality, bridled by an understanding that you have a moral obligation, a faithful obligation, not to go outside those bounds that have been laid out for us. If that's the case, you have liberty. You have liberty within you have freedom, and the bridle that goes on freedom is the moral underpinnings that we must adhere to as Americans. And that's why this Constitution works for us, we know. And so within liberty are those rights that are defined in the first 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. The liberty for freedom of speech and religion, and a freedom to assembly and peaceably assemble for redress of grievances, freedom to keep and bear arms, the freedom from double jeopardy, the freedom to keep and own property, the freedom to have a trial by the jury of our peers, the freedom for the powers that are not defined within the Constitution for the federal government to devolve down for the states or the people respectively. That's all liberty. Everything I've defined in there is liberty, provided that it's within the moral boundaries. But I take us up the ladder of the priorities of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, eudaimonia. Pursuit of happiness is subordinated to liberty. You can develop yourself, Mr. Speaker, intellectually and spiritually in the philosophy of our founding fathers, provided that you don't trample on someone else's liberty. If I want to develop my knowledge base, my spiritual base, I can exercise my freedom of religion, my freedom of speech, my freedom of assembly in any way that I so choose under the rights that we have that are liberties, provided that I don't trample on the liberty of someone else. I can't take a position that says you will be censored because I'm going to exercise my freedom of speech, or you can't assemble because I don't like what you say. I'm exercising my freedom of assembly. You must not. I can exercise my pursuit of happiness, my development, my own liberties, provided I don't trample someone else's. Founding Fathers understood that priority, and in the exercise of our liberties, freedom of speech, religion, assembly, keep and bear arms, the list that I've given, Mr. Speaker, in no case can we take someone else's life in the expansion of our liberties. If I say that there's someone that encroaches upon my liberties, therefore I'm going to take their life, I have violated the principles of the Declaration, the principles of this country, not let alone the laws of the United States of America. And so we need to understand that the Founding Fathers laid out prioritized rights in the Declaration: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that pursuit of happiness cannot trample on liberty or life, and the exercise of our liberties cannot trample on life. They understood that, and that life is the most sacred. And if we understand also that life begins at the instant of conception, and we need to protect that life both in law and in fact, and provide for those who cannot scream for their own mercy, cannot speak for themselves, that protection for life. All of that is wrapped up in this Constitution and in the rights that the gentlelady referred to, the gentlelady from the District of Columbia referred to. And I go back to law schools in this land teaching Constitution law as if this Constitution is a living, breathing document and some amorphous combination of case law created by activist lawyers, activist judges, and sometimes, I'll say, compliant juries, because they seldom see the big picture of what's going on. They have respect for what's taught in law schools. They have respect for judges sitting behind the bench. I do too. But I will take this position, Mr. Speaker, and that is any judge that believes they can amend the Constitution by their policy decision on case law should not be seated on that bench. Anyone who takes an oath to a Constitution and they believe it was whatever it will be defined to mean by somebody that comes along later, they should stop and take stock of what they are about to do. That may be a violation of conscience, just not thought through. And I would say that as I look at some of the decisions on some of the judges, we had a major case in Iowa a couple of years ago called Varnum v. Brien. 7 state Supreme Court justices universally declared that they could find rights in the Constitution that were up to this point unimagined. They wrote unanimously that they had discovered unimagined rights in the Constitution itself. Now, can you imagine a guarantee with unimagined rights, Mr. Speaker? The Founding Fathers could not have imagined allowing judges to sit on a bench who believed that they could write any decision they chose to write, that they could manufacture unimagined rights in order to get their public policy in place. But that's exactly what happened in Iowa in that case. Now 3 of those judges were up for retention, and Iowans voted them off the bench. Now there are 3 new Supreme Court justices there, and hopefully there's a reconsideration among the other 4. Excuse me. In about 10? Okay, thanks. You got it, that's right. Thanks, Louis. And so the unimagined rights that were inserted into the Supreme Court decision imposed same-sex marriage on the state of Iowa. And that brought about some people like my good friend Congressman Louis Gohmert came there to help with that cause. I went on the bus and helped with that cause. We made the constitutional argument consistently and continually. It's an example, Mr. Speaker. But we have a number of other examples of activist courts. And I'm concerned about what has happened historically. And I'll make this point that if I look through the continuum of Supreme Court cases that take us to where we are today, and we have a conscience protection piece of legislation before this Congress. One of them may have had a vote in the Senate this afternoon, and that would be Senator Blunt's language, Senator Blunt from Missouri. In this Congress, it's Jeff Fortenberry from Nebraska, who understood conscience protection and introduced the legislation that protects the health care providers and from all of us, from the full, for our religious liberty. And this Congress may get a vote on it, and it may actually have failed in the Senate this afternoon, is what I'm advised was about to happen. I haven't confirmed that, and it could actually be happening after I'm finished speaking, Mr. Speaker. But what I see as happening is that the Constitution protects our religious liberty, our religious rights, and still this government steps in to usurp them. This executive branch steps in to usurp our religious rights. To this extent, and I'll take you, Mr. Speaker, through this continuum that is appalling to me, and it would be appalling to the Founding Fathers had they lived through these decisions. 1965, no, excuse me, I'll go back to 1963, Mr. Speaker. There was a case called Murray v. Curlett. And I don't know that that's very well universally recognized, but that was a case that took prayer out of the public schools. There was an argument made before the activist court in 1963 that there was a separation of church and state, and that separation of church and state was firm enough and solid enough that we could not pray in our public schools because that advocated for a religion. And so I'll read to you the language that surely had to be reviewed by the Supreme Court justices. It says, Congress shall make, this is the First Amendment, Mr. Speaker, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And it goes on, of course, freedom of speech, the press, and the right of the people to assemble. It says, Congress shall make no law. There was no law that came from Congress that established a religion. The law that Congress made just didn't exist with religious freedom because Congress understood that the First Amendment means what it says. The textual reading and the original understanding said Congress shall not establish a religion. That we're not going to be like Sweden establishing Lutheranism as a state religion. We're going to have freedom of religion, but it shall not establish a religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But if you believe in judge-made law, the Supreme Court, by that decision in '63, Murray versus Curlett, outlawed prayer in the public schools by a court decision. I think it's in direct violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. If we're going to respect judge-made law and stop praying in our public schools, that was the beginning of the judicial activism that's begun to break down this civilization and this culture. I think those decisions needed to be made at the local school level, not at the Supreme Court level. And I remember sitting as a freshman in high school, and this news came to me I was sitting in general science class, and they said, now there will be no more prayer in our school. And I remember thinking, what does that actually stop? How will they stop us from praying if the teachers decide not to? Does that mean I can't? Can we not as students? Can I not pray before a test? I needed help, I will tell you. And a thought process went through my mind. The only way that the federal government could prohibit prayer in the public schools would be to clear out the public schools. If we insisted on following through, they'd have to empty the schools. Otherwise, there was going to be prayer in the public schools as well as our parochial schools. They would have to come in and march us all out of school, chain the doors shut, and post a guard to prevent prayer in the public schools. And so what did we do? We genuflected to the Supreme Court, accepted the Murray versus Curlett decision in 1963, stopped activity of public prayer in public schools, and we've had subsequent decisions along the way about whether students could pray, whether athletes could pray, whether coaches could pray with athletes, whether the coaches could be there when athletes prayed with themselves. All of these things decided by a Supreme Court who believes in stare decisis, that there was a decision made in 63 and that they're somehow bound by that decision, rather than looking back at the plain text of this Constitution and concluding that as long as Congress doesn't make a law establishing a state religion or interfere with the practice of religion, then it isn't the federal government's business to be engaged in religious activity that takes place in the public or the private schools. But that's what happened in 63. And then, Mr. Speaker, 1965, we went through, at breakneck speed, went through the Constitution over here at the Supreme Court, out those doorways and off that way, breakneck speed. This was Griswold v. Connecticut. At that time, Connecticut and Massachusetts and multiple other states had outlawed contraceptives in their states. That meant that you couldn't go in and buy contraceptives at the drugstore. The case of Griswold was brought against, Griswold brought the case against the state of Connecticut and said, your state law that bans contraceptives is unconstitutional. And they went before the Supreme Court and argued. And what are you going to base that on? How does the state not have a power that's not all non-enumerated powers are reserved for the states or the people respectively? So the Constitution, I'd say, defines that the states had that power. But yet the Supreme Court, in their imagination in 1965, created this right to privacy. A right to privacy fabricated out of whole cloth, didn't exist in the Constitution, doesn't exist today in the Constitution, but it exists on the lips of every law school professor that's teaching Constitution law as a right to privacy that's been created now by the Supreme Court. They say it was in this Constitution somehow, but it had never been discovered until the Supreme Court discovered it in Griswold versus Connecticut. So it was against the law in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and multiple other states to even allow for, even sell contraceptives. So the Supreme Court created a right to privacy and outlawed the ban on contraceptives in Connecticut. I say if you lived in Connecticut in 1965 and you wanted contraceptives, you could drive across the state line or you could move to another state. That was the vision of the laboratories of the state experiment of the Founding Fathers. States' rights, 10th Amendment. They imposed that on in 1965. The right to privacy became, oh, by the way, in 1972 there was a case called Eisenstadt that said, well, if you're just, it was just married people in Griswold in 1965. Eisenstadt came along and said, well, if there's a right to privacy for married people to be able to purchase contraceptives, surely that exists for unmarried people as well. They imposed that on, and the federal government took another reach, and now we have the foundation for Roe versus Wade, which turned into the right to privacy became the foundational argument for Roe versus Wade in '73, just 8 years after Griswold, and they found in the emanations and penumbras a right to abortion. Only the right to abortion of a non-viable fetus, I might add, but the companion case was Doe versus Bolton, and in that case it said, but there will be exceptions to the viable fetus if it has the health of the mother is considered. And health of the mother was defined to be mental, physical, or familial health of the mother, and so it was an open door right to any kind of an abortion. This all rooted in judicial activism, I might add. And today, seeing what has happened in Griswold and them setting aside a state law, now to the point where the President of the United States, Mr. Speaker, stepped before a press conference 2 weeks ago on a Friday at noon, and he said, well, okay, I might have gotten a little hot water about taking away the rights to conscience of the Catholic Church and other religious institutions by telling them through Kathleen Sebelius that they shall provide not just contraceptives any longer. I want to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't just that. It was contraceptives, sterilizations, and abortifacients, pills that cause abortion, requiring religious organizations, pro-life organizations, especially the Catholic Church, to provide that if they're going to provide any kind of health care for their employees or their patients. A direct, clear imposition of a violation of rights to conscience. And Father Jonathan Morris said publicly that you cannot force someone to violate their conscience. You keep your convictions of your conscience even unto death. I applaud the position that he has taken. I endorse that position that he has taken. But now, a few days after this announcement came out and the heat came on the President, his noon press conference on that Friday, he stepped up and instead of, let's say, legislating within the confines of the Constitution itself, the Supreme law of the land, or amending the Constitution if you disagree with what it says, or even legislating from the bench as Griswold, Eisenstadt, Roe, and Doe, and many others have done, we have now a president with the highest degree of audacity I have ever seen, and by the way, he uses that term audacity pretty often. He thinks he's legislating by press conference. And he said, well, I'm not going to impose this on you any longer, Catholic Church and others. I'm going to impose it upon the insurance companies. They shall provide contraceptives, sterilizations, abortifacients, abortion-causing pills, and they shall do it no charge. The audacity of the President of the United States to issue such a thing, and we should not comply with such an unconstitutional order from the President of the United States. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back the balance of my time, should there be any.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman have a motion?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until noon on Monday next for morning hour debate.
Earlier today in the House, members approved a measure directing the historian of the House to collect oral histories from members of Congress involved